Hello, this is a recording of a Winchester Heritage Open Days event live streamed in 2020. We hope you enjoy it.
Good evening. I'm Annie Reilly. I am head of producing at the National Trust, which means that I look after a lot of national programs. And I might even say my favourite one of those is Heritage Open Days, which is the UK's largest festival of history and culture, which happens every September. Which sees thousands of people across the country curating and creating openings, happenings, events, talks, walks of every sort. And Winchester is a sterling example, shall we say, of Heritage Open Days. And it is my absolute pleasure to have been asked here tonight to talk to Melanie a little bit about House Histories. So Melanie Backe-Hansen, who is here with us tonight, is an independent historian, writer and speaker, specialising in the social history of houses across the United Kingdom. Melanie is a research consultant for the popular BBC programme, A House Through Time. And to accompany the series, Melanie has co-written the new book, A House Through Time, with historian David Olusoga. She was series historical consultant and on-screen expert for Phil Spencer's History of Britain in 100 Homes. She is also the author of House Histories, The Secrets Behind Your Front Door, and Historic Streets and Squares, The Secrets on Your Doorstep. The main focus of Melanie's work involves original research for homeowners across the country to provide research reports and bespoke house histories books. Melanie regularly contributes to national media and appears on television, radio, and online media. She is also a regular speaker at events and festivals, as well as universities and history groups. Melanie is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, member of the Royal Historical Society, and an honorary teaching fellow at the University of Dundee. So I'm sure you will all join me in welcoming Melanie this evening. Welcome to Heritage Open Days. Welcome to Winchester Heritage Open Days.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for that amazing introduction.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you know, it's easy to say amazing things when you've got a track record like that and know a lot about the secrets behind houses, which is really wonderful. So, just to start off with, as I said, you are a historian, a house historian, but I think it would be really useful to hear a little more about what that exactly means. What does your work look like? What does that mean to be an historian and house historian? And I suppose too a little bit about how you got to be where you are now, how you got to be Melanie Backe-Hansen, house historian.
Wow, yes. I mean, it's a great question actually, because it's an unusual field of history, the study of history. It's quite unique. It's only becoming a little bit more well known in recent years, but yeah, even in history circles, it's a bit unusual. But in essence, I am a social historian, but I look at the stories of social history through the avenue of a house. So I do look at architecture, but I'm not an architectural historian. So I think a lot of people will think, in the past, a lot of the times it's books or television about big stately homes and what groundbreaking architectural feature was introduced by Lord such and such, but actually I look far more at it's the stories of people. It's about the stories inside the houses. So whether that's a house that was built in the 1930s or the 1530s, and it's the stories of all the families and the events that went on, who were the first people to walk across that threshold, who were the people that have inhabited the spaces within a house. And obviously people who've watched A House Through Time will have an inkling of that, and obviously the amazing stories that can be found. And it is very much looking at the documentary evidence. So you literally trace as many sources as possible to piece together all those stories. But what is amazing is that actually you can find out all those amazing stories, especially for perhaps less well-known people. These are not aristocracy, they're not lords and generals of military or whatever. Actually, it's seemingly ordinary people, but they can actually have extraordinary stories, or they actually reveal so much about perhaps a national event, or how did a family cope through the First World War, or there's so many different things you can find. And the way I got into it is a little bit different. Essentially, I studied history at university, but I ended up going into publishing in the completely different direction. But I found an opportunity, and it was an estate agent. And I wasn't an estate agent, let me just say. I always feel I need to clarify. But in essence, I was hired to research the history of the houses that were on the market in order to help promote them for sale or let. So that was, piecing together some fun stories that might gain publicity, etc., etc. And through that process, obviously it was such an amazing opportunity, but I got asked to write my first book, and then increasingly got asked to do more and more private commissions. So I've now been freelance for over 8 years. So it's amazing opportunities to go into houses all over the UK and research the histories. So yeah, that's kind of how it all started.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and it's that's a thing that comes through so strongly in all of your work, that the stories of these places and how this may sound like stating the obvious, but how three-dimensional houses are. You know, as you said, they have architectural history and all that, but they are absolutely, that's a stepping stone to social history, to global history. And do you think that there's a growing interest in houses? It feels like there is, in the stories behind it. You know, it feels like more and more people want to know about the people rather than about what style of brick they have and that sort of thing. Do you think that's a thing that's shifting a bit?
Yeah, I would 100% agree. I mean, I think it's been evolving slowly over recent years. I mean, the fact that I had that role with an estate agent, but also through the growing interest in genealogy and people's family history. And some people have, you know, gone through their family history and then discovered that they had their family home in a different part of the country, or it was an ancestral home or something. But even if it was just actually where your grandparents lived or something, and people like, oh, what was going on? And so people have started to kind of edge into house histories that way. But also obviously from television with A House Through Time. But also I think in general, there seems to be a growing interest in that sort of personal history, and actually people realizing that it's not just kings and queens. Actually, it's the stories of ordinary folk, and it's actually whether that was an experience of an ancestor in I don't know, a mill in the 19th century, or whether that was they discovered their ancestors came from a fishing community down in Cornwall, and there was all these stories about what was, I don't know, anything and everything. And actually a house gives an avenue into discovering all those stories. And there's so much to it, because it's also discovering how people lived, and actually how did people actually go about their day-to-day lives before there was internal plumbing and you had to go out to the lab at the back, or you didn't have a kitchen in the house and you just had a range, or even before that you just had a fire in the fireplace. So all these different ways of people living, and in some cases it wasn't that long ago, you know, like, so there's so much to discover about how people lived in the house as well. And then uncovering so many different stories. Like I think in every single house I do, there's something, you know, there can be scandal and drama. Obviously, everyone loves that. But also, there's real life stories about how people coped and the experiences that people had, which are not that dissimilar to what we experience now. So I think people are finding that connection with personal history and finding it really fascinating. Yeah,
it's such a more relatable sphere, isn't it? So many of us, so few of us live in castles, and luckily so few of us go into battle or are there when major political decisions are made, but most of us have a house and do those daily things, and that's such a relatable sphere. And that's really interesting. That echoes a lot with what Heritage Open Days is about, what Winchester Heritage Open Days is about, in terms of that kind of the bits of history that maybe don't always make it into the capital H history books, but that are so revealing and really connect you with the past in that way.
Absolutely.
So what makes a good house to research? Like, what's your criteria? What are you looking for? You know, when you go out there thinking, Got to do another house.
Well,
are there things that make a good house to research?
Well, I mean, actually, I don't know. You can. It's almost like don't judge a book by its cover. You know, like actually, you can have a seemingly ordinary looking house and still find amazing stories. So yes, you can find some, you know, drama in a I don't know, a townhouse in Mayfair that's had dukes and all sorts going on. But you know, there's a house I researched in Norfolk, and it's literally a 2 up, 2 down, you know, small village in Norfolk. And even now it's a small village, you know. So actually, when it was first built in the middle of the 19th century, it was tiny rural village with everyone most people were laborers and working on farms. But actually I discovered that actually in the turn of the 20th century, the house was owned by one of the few survivors of the charge of the Light Brigade from the Battle of Balaclava in the Crimean War. And this amazing story came about he survived for a start. He was rank and file cavalryman. He got through it, which was unusual because a lot of them didn't get through it. But he also wrote a diary of his experiences, and that's actually how his story came about, because the diary went on auction and sold a few years ago. But he told the story about how he got shot and he got stabbed, and he came out but barely. And then he ended up in a hospital, and of course he was in a hospital with Florence Nightingale doing her yeah, absolutely, and it's literally a small cottage in a village in Norfolk, and it's not a grand palace, it's not, so it's a bit tricky to say it doesn't necessarily have to appear like a very historic house to have a really good story or good history. So you just never know. And actually, I'm quite fortunate because through my work, people contact me, and actually I end up with all range of houses. So it could be a Victorian terraced house in a city, or it could be a slightly larger, a manor house type in the Cotswolds or something. But it's everything, and that's the point. Actually, you can still find stories. So
It strikes me that there might be a sense, I think I would have if I were doing what you're describing, a sense of saving and preserving these stories that probably otherwise, like you said, it's a fairly new, this approach to house histories. Those stories could very easily just have faded into the past, and they're important and they're beautiful and they're relatable. That must be. Do you ever have a sense of like, actually, I'm bringing this story? I'm saving it.
Definitely. And especially when I discover it, because actually sometimes, you can find all the records, but fortunately someone might have all the deeds, and so you actually can piece together quite swiftly the owners and the occupants and piece it all together. But in some cases there's, it's a bit more of a detective job, and actually you're piecing together snippets. And so when you actually piece something together and then you realize that there's this incredible story, and you're like, no, I don't, oh my gosh, like I am one of those people in the archives that does that, everyone else is quiet and I do, but I do definitely have that feeling. So as you said earlier, it's the sort of stories that are often not in the history books. They're stories of ordinary people, but perhaps had extraordinary circumstances, or they were put, perhaps they fought in one of the wars and ended up, winning the Victoria Cross or something. And I did a house in Oxfordshire where it was a very strange house actually, but the person he kind of rebuilt it after the Second World War, but prior to that it was 2 cottages and he put it together. And I realized that he ended up being a prisoner of war in Italy during the Second World War. But just at the point where Italy had were on the way out, so to speak, he made an escape from the prisoner of war camp and actually made a new route through Switzerland to escape. And it was, and fortunately there were records in the National Archives, and I was with the documents going, oh no, this amazing story about this man who'd escaped through the hills of Switzerland to get away from, extraordinary. And then he ends up basically retiring to a small village in Oxfordshire where he rebuilt this house, and that was his story. So, yes, he was in the military, but actually there was so much more to his story. So, again, there's all sorts.
That's wonderful. And too, that makes one think, the stories that are hidden in houses today. And, it's just the confounding and surprising elements of people essentially.
Because at the end of the day, it's people's experiences. So it might not be a hero of the war, but it might be perhaps the experience of a servant in a household, or perhaps it was the experiences of women in a household who were perhaps they were out working but then had to come home and take care of the family, and what were their experiences. And quite often it's in the house that you discover those stories, because that's where they're recorded, and actually that's where they're stories of their husband, but then you find out that they had 10 children, but then you discover that the woman was still going out to work, and you're like, well, how on earth did she go out to work and then take care of 10 children? And like all these kind of things through the house that you discover that.
And I suppose too, there's an element, because it is a house and it is a home, there are there's bits of history that might get left, but also some of those people who might get left out, women, servants, people whose stories have, for one reason or another, been pushed to the sidelines. This feels like a way. Is it a way into some of those lesser known stories? It is a way in. I'm constantly always aware that I want to read between the lines, though. I mean, I guess this is the case with any historian. It's what isn't recorded in the documents, because we're very much reliant on what survived, what documents are there. And actually, in a lot of cases, it's just the head of the house, or it's just the owner who's recorded. So you don't to try and delve down to the stories of the people that lived in the house, and quite often they're not very well recorded. So I'm constantly like, well, what was really going on, So it's a challenge in that way as well. It's proper detective work, though. I mean,
I know. I think I quite like sort of Agatha Christie and those sorts of things. So I think this is where my detective skills are trying to come together.
CSI Georgian Townhouse, essentially. Yes. That's because there are multiple instances in your books where you talk about it being, use the word, I think, obsessive, and use the word addictive at different points, for yourself, and also for, I think that a lot of people have that experience. But do you think there is something uniquely obsessing about, about house histories, or do you think that's just research in general? What's your experience? Do you think there's something? It could be just research in general, I think, but I wonder that because a lot of these stories aren't recorded and it does take a bit of detective work, you do end up, not down the rabbit hole, but you kind of wanting to find out everything. So it can become that way. But the same way that perhaps people who do family history perhaps do the same thing, and they're constantly looking for that lost cousin, or, that sort of thing. But I wonder that perhaps it's just research, but also because more documents are becoming available, I think it's become more accessible. So perhaps that's why, yes, there's a lot of sources you still need to view in the archives or libraries, but in a lot of cases you can actually start delving into this online, and especially while we've been in lockdown, it's actually, you can use a lot of subscription sites to start delving, and you can piece together quite a bit just from your front room. And so perhaps because, more documents have become available, it's perhaps opened up more of an opportunity for people to research. So that's, I can see why people might start getting the bug, I suppose it's more accessible, and I suppose also if more stuff's becoming available, then there's that sense of like, oh, I couldn't piece that bit together. Maybe this document means I will. That must bring you back to some of the same stories as well, and wanting to find out the next piece of the puzzle.
Definitely.
And I suppose too that might be as well because it's people's stories, and people are endlessly fascinating, which kind of brings us back.
And you very much want to find out who they were. Some records will give you their occupation and give you a bit of the picture of who they were, but then you start delving a bit further, and you look at things like wills, and actually I found some amazing stories in wills, because actually that's where you not only get the story of how the property might have transferred from one family member to another, but there was one which was just amazing, and the family had no clue, because it was more of an estate, so it was quite a lot of property involved. But they knew something went on with their sort of grandparents or the great grandparents, but didn't know what. And then it turned out it was actually a very long will, it's because there was so much property involved. But the grandfather had actually disinherited his son and passed everything on to his grandchildren, and there were quite a lot of grandchildren. And it turns out because his son had had an affair with a woman in the neighbouring village and had an illegitimate child. And so the grandfather just disinherited entirely his son and left everything to the children. And it all came out in this will, and the family then, who I was researching for now, had no clue that there was this illegitimate child and there was this drama, and it went to the divorce court, and it just, it ended up being this family drama. It all how the property passed, but actually the will opened up all this who the people were and what was going on. And the divorce records, even things like, yes, on this date, he was known to have met Mary Smith at such and such, So it was incredible. All sorts of things you can sort of delve into more of the stories of who people were.
Well, it's that reading between the lines that you were talking about. It's that, most wills are probably fairly dry documents, but then it just takes that little bit of prying open, and you realize all the subtext and the story behind it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. And it's thinking about wills too, that's about our relationship to things and to people. And I think I have to ask you, do you see people's relationship to their homes shifting because of lockdown? I mean, we all have we've all had very different relationships, I think, with our homes and with our houses since March than probably a lot of us ever have done. Do you think, have you noticed any shifts? What's your historian's perspective on that, I suppose?
Well, I think so. I mean, I've heard enough from sort of property people and also just in the general public that actually, obviously, people are at home far more than they perhaps were before. And actually, they're now sharing space, like everyone's working from home, or perhaps, they were also teaching children at home. And so, it gave a new perspective on how people lived in their home. And so I think there's definitely been a shift. And actually, if you talk to a lot of property people, the rise in interest in properties outside of cities that have perhaps a garden or perhaps a bit more space are on the rise. And so I think people are shifting. And a lot of people already talking about this pandemic effect, and actually how that's going to impact, even in 20 years' time or 50 years' time, we'll look back and there will be a shift in how we lived in our houses. And whether that's also people doing DIY and doing up bits of their house, or perhaps it's just people sitting in their living room or their kitchen and thinking, what was this room before, I wonder? Or looking up at the ceiling and seeing maybe there's a existing cornice or a ceiling rose, and it makes people think, well, okay, what was this room before? What was going on? And so it just, perhaps it has made people, just stop and think for a minute, where they might not have ever had that time before. So it's, I think there is a definite shift. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds in the coming years. So
I think that makes perfect sense. As you said, people will have had, in the same way that a lot of people have connected more with, say, the nature right outside their windows, that people will have just and people will have just noticed. And I can imagine there will be at some point, sort of the architectural equivalent of noticing these massive, DIY kind of cosmetic changes in 1 year. And there's also something interesting about there being a census next year, I suppose, too, and how different that might look. In the same way, I suppose, the 1921 came so close after World War I and after, the suffrage movement.
Yeah, it's interesting because actually, I mean, the one thing was a couple of years ago they were sort of saying they might not do another one. So actually, there was I think there was a panic from all historians because they were going, no, you can't possibly not do a census. It's one of the most vital sources we have got. So you know, so it's, I guess it's fortunate that there is one. But yeah, I think I mean, I hope also people take it more seriously, because I think part of the reason they were saying they might not do one is because a lot of householders perhaps didn't care so much, or they weren't so interested in filling it out. But hopefully there will be perhaps a bit more of a they'll take a bit more of a moment to go, okay, yes, this is who we are in our house, and this is what it looks like. So yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Like you said, you know, the future historians will be wanting that census data, I'm sure, because it will be the doorway to the extraordinary stories of today in the way that you've described.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions about, well, I just want to know some of your favorite stories. I mean, you've told some corkers already, Melanie, but are there a couple that you were just, you know, the stories or the histories or the bits of the detective work? Can you give us a couple of favorites, if that makes sense?
Yeah, 100%. Well, I probably have to, well, it is quite tricky, I have to say, because I find them all really interesting. Like, so whichever one I'm working on is fascinating. But perhaps one of the best ones I had, it's a house in the Cotswolds, so it's now part of Gloucestershire, previously part of Worcestershire, and so it's turned around with boundaries. But it started off as a small farmhouse and then was extended. But it was delving through the records. I actually got back into the late 18th century, but it was known to be much older than that. So it was kind of a funny one, because actually I was like, where is it all? You know, like actually I came up against a brick wall. Unfortunately, the client said, okay, let's spend a bit more time trying to piece it together further back. And then I found this elusive document in Birmingham archives, which is a bit strange, so you never know where these things are. But it was basically a marriage agreement from the 1764. But as part of, obviously the marriage laws were different then, so part of the process was the property of the woman was going to the husband. So in order to verify the provenance of this property, or at least the history of this property, it was all recorded in this marriage agreement. So it was literally this archive moment of like, yes, because basically it took the story all the way back to 1586. And it was, not only did it give the owner, but it also gave the occupant. And I was able to trace the occupants, and a family who'd been in that area for generations, which was brilliant. But even better, I discovered that 1588, the property was owned by the bishops of Worcester, but then they gave it to Queen Elizabeth I. So that was like, oh my God, okay.
Wow, yeah.
Then she gave it to her personal physician at the time, who was a man called Dr. Lopez. So this is obviously late 16th century, time of the Spanish Armada. There's all sorts of intrigue and court espionage going on. And he was accused of actually trying to poison the Queen by a bit of a court enemy. So he ended up being arrested. I mean, it's still to this day, it's a bit spurious, and this, still it's highly unlikely he was, but anyway, he ended up being put on the rack. Then he confessed to actually, yes, he was trying to poison the Queen. But of course, you'd do anything to get off the rack, wouldn't you? So then he renounced that confession, but he did end up being executed for treason in 1594. But the story was such a big story at the time, that it's actually thought to be, his story was the inspiration for Shylock in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. So already the owners of the house are like, oh my gosh, we've got Queen Elizabeth I, we've got Shakespeare. But then 200 years later, 1790s, it was owned, the house had been extended, and it was now more of sort of a large gentleman's residence. And it had turned out that this John Wheatcroft was the owner. He ended up moving to France. So this is about the 1790s, which of course is the time of the French Revolution, where he was based in Le Havre, so became a very successful merchant. So while all hell was breaking loose in Paris with the French Revolution, he was doing very well down in Le Havre. But he was doing so well that he became quite friendly with Thomas Jefferson, the future president of the United States. And there were records of letters between them. So once Thomas Jefferson had gone back to America with his family, there were letters between them. And also at the same time, John Wheatcroft, he ended up renting rooms to Mary Wollstonecraft, who was writing her book on the French Revolution. And then while she was there, gave birth to her first daughter, Fanny Imlay, and John Wheatcroft was a witness to the birth and is on the birth register. So this is all from one house in the Cotswolds. This incredible stories unraveled. So that's got to be one of my favorites. I mean, there were all sorts of things as well about, you know, the farm and what was going on actually with the house, but those stories and those connections were just brilliant, you know. So that's
amazing. Yeah. And also how it all, you know, for me, I have this image of just a thread and then it just unravels and you just see all these, and it also reminds me of that, you know, the 6 degrees of separation theory. It feels like that house, by 6 degrees of separation, you know, half of the founding fathers of America and probably loads of French merchants are connected to it.
Yeah.
You know, that's extraordinary.
Yeah. So that's definitely one of my top ones.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know if we've got time for more. I have no idea what the time is, but
well, I'm gonna ask you to do one more favorite story, and then I think we do have some questions. But I'm too selfish to not ask you to do another one. So there you go, and then we'll turn over to some questions.
Okay. Probably very different. It's actually a mansion block in the middle of London. And the funny thing about this, as we were saying earlier, you can't judge a book by its cover. You can't judge a house by its story, by its appearance. And actually, this is a 1929, you know, people started moving in 1930. And it's in Marylebone, so central London, very, you know, wealthy part of London. And it turns out that during the Second World War, one of the flats in this block was used by the French section of the Special Operations Executive. And it was particularly used to recruit spies who were going to be dropped into occupied France. And this incredible story just and the French section was known for women. So I ended up doing so much reading on the women who ended up being spies in France. And actually a lot of them didn't return. They ended up in concentration camps and all this. But it was extraordinary. It was a flat in this mansion block in the middle of London. And I just sort of imagine all these sort of James Bond types kind of, you know, you know, like, but it was extraordinary. And the stories of how they were recruited and then they were sent off to the country to have training in espionage and radio signals and things. And it's just incredible. And that was probably one of the best in terms of, you know, a lot of people will think it's just a flat. You're not going to find anything. And then this amazing story that was key to the effort of the Second World War, and the extraordinary stories of the men and women who were part of the Special Operations Executive. And it was just a flat in a mansion block. So
Wow. You know, that cliche of everyone has a novel inside them. I think it sounds like every house has at least 3 inside them is what I would say. Yeah. Now, I'm going to be brave and try and use the Q&A function here. So we do have quite a few questions.
Okay.
So here's an interesting one. What is the oldest house you have worked on, and how long did it take to complete your research?
Oh, well, okay, I'll answer that in 2 ways. I had probably the oldest one I had was actually a former chantry house, which was down in Dorset, and it was built in 1490, and it had an incredible story because it was stone built, and an early chantry was basically attached to a chantry priest who was set up to pray for the souls of their benefactor or their and then, of course, at the dissolution of the monasteries, dissolution of the chantries came a little bit later. It stopped being that and ended up being a farmhouse for generations, actually, which is actually why it's now Grade 1 listed, which is very rare for a house. You know, we're talking the equivalent of Westminster Abbey or St Paul's Cathedral, like. But largely because it had continued just being a farmhouse, nothing had changed. So you've still got this, you know, timber spiral staircase. You've got original timber paneling from the 15th century. You know, like it's extraordinary. And obviously the timber roof, and then an enormous inglenook fireplace. You know, that has an extraordinary story. But I didn't actually in that case. So in terms of how long it took, that one was a bit of more of a brief overview because actually the architectural features were the main part of it. But actually, as it happens, I'm researching a house at the moment which is built in the 1520s. And talking about how long it takes, this one is up there with one of the most trickiest. It's a small timber-framed farmhouse, effectively, but it's been changed quite a lot. It's actually had a full architectural survey. But it's part of it is added later, part of it was built this time, and they added this bit and that. And in the records, there's just not a lot left. So to try and trace it back to the 1520s is proving quite a challenge. So obviously there's some manorial records, and I'm piecing my way through those. But that's taking weeks, basically. It takes a long time. And particularly because actually even in the 19th century, the house is not clearly named. And actually this happens all the time, you know, names and numbers change. But in this case, because it was literally, it's in a rural location. So it's quite often just, you know, the house on this, you know, in this area. So it's really vague. So you end up having to piece it together through the owners. Yeah, so it's a bit more of a puzzle. So that one, yeah. So when you're talking about really old houses, it can take a while.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have another question from Tracy who asks, Melanie, have you researched a house that turned out to be disappointing with nothing of significance and are present day owners unhappy if you do? That's a very good question.
Yeah, I mean, it does happen. Yeah, there are some houses which you don't find Queen Elizabeth I, or, you know, but I mean, I'm just trying to think. It does tend to be perhaps Victorian terrace houses, which, you know, there might not have necessarily been anything dramatic happen. But in the end, actually, I'm thinking of one particular house which was built, 19th century West London, part of the sort of expansion of London when the railways and the underground went through. But I did find a lot of the personal stories, like for example, the house was first named after the daughter of the builder, and the current owners had never known where that name had come from. So to find that personal connection with the builder. But so there's always little snippets, you know, and actually it turned out there was a little bit of drama with it was an unhappy drama where there was divorce proceedings because the husband was actually beating the wife. It's very familiar for those who watched A House Through Time. There were stories of this in the Liverpool. But it all came out because it's a little bit later. It's actually recorded in all the divorce papers, and he ended up going and living with another woman and abandoning the first wife. And so that was a bit of, but actually, as it turns out, you piece together these snippets of people's lives. But the current owners still loved it. There was still so much to the house, even though it perhaps wasn't, you know, massively dramatic. Or there certainly weren't any famous people there. So you might end up finding, you know, ordinary people who had ordinary jobs and lived happily ever after. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think people are still interested in finding out, you know, the stories and, you know, even just clarifying when it was built and who were the first families to move in and things like that. So So we've got another question from Gemma.
who says, picking up on something I said a bit, it is true. It is said that truth is stranger than fiction. Have you ever considered writing a novel based on some of the amazing stories you have uncovered?
Yeah, I have, and actually, I've got a number of very good friends who are fiction authors, and they're always telling me, "Why don't you write these?" So I need to. I think I'm so used to writing non-fiction that it's a bit scary to sort of venture into fiction. But yeah, there are a lot of really good stories that I could somehow bring myself to write. So yeah, watch this space. Maybe I'll build up the courage to give it a go. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. We have another question from Ellie, who says, what advice do you have for students interested in working with, well, historic houses? And thank you for this lovely talk. So some thanks from Ellie, and a question about advice for students.
Oh, wow. Well, I guess I don't deal with historic houses so much, or those that are open. You know, most of them are actually private residential homes. So it's a tricky question, I'm not sure. But from what I gather, I mean, it's tough because I think you end up having to do voluntary work. You know, especially at the moment, it's so many houses are actually closed. You know, like for example, actually, I'm going to Bristol in a week or two, and I haven't spent a lot of time in Bristol, and I had this list of houses that I wanted to go visit, and still, sadly, quite a lot of them are closed. So it's a bit tricky at the moment. But yeah, I mean, whether there's also you know, other voluntary options with researching, helping. A lot of historic houses have their own archives, or actually don't know the full history of the house. In a lot of cases, they do, but so perhaps there's an opportunity for students to volunteer their time to go to the archives, or to start, you know, do a bit of research in offering the services and piecing together the history. So there's that side of it too.
And there's several questions which I'm going to kind of group together, and which are people who are obviously, I think, probably partly inspired by hearing you talk about it, inspired to want to research their own houses, and just looking for some top tips, I think, on where to start with all that. So maybe a few top tips. Yeah.
Probably, yeah, at the moment, obviously, a lot of archives are reopening, which is amazing, which is fantastic. You know, long may it continue. But if you are just starting out and you're just delving into it from your own home, maps is probably the best place to start. A lot of maps are actually available online. And so one of the best places to go is to look at the Ordnance Survey collection. And you can view these on a few different sites. There's the National Library of Scotland, and they actually cover the whole of the UK. So you can actually go into digital maps and zoom into the location, and then see historic maps available for that location. And you can actually track it. Oh, sorry. Can everyone hear me okay?
You're breaking up a tiny bit, but
okay,
we're here for it. Don't worry.
Okay. Yes, so you can go through, and you can actually track it through time. So they started sort of making Ordnance Survey maps in detail from around the 1860s and 70s, and then periodically updated them. So you can actually track from the 1860s to perhaps the 1890s, then to the 1910s, then to the 1930s. So you can actually track it, and you can actually spot perhaps your house wasn't there in the 1860s, but then it appears on the map in the 1880s or 1890s. So you can narrow down when it was built. But there's also other map sites. There's one called old-maps.co.uk, and that's also Ordnance Survey. But there's also things like bomb damage maps. There's the parish and county maps. You've got things like tithe maps and enclosure maps. And some of these, again, they're available depending on your area. You might be able to find some of them online. So there's Layers of London is an amazing website which actually has so many. It's brilliant. I've been doing some research in London recently, and it's just brilliant. You can actually trace a location in London way, you know, basically to the 16th century or even earlier. If you're in the center of London, you can track the Roman city of Londinium. So that's brilliant. Then there's also like Know Your Place Southwest. So that does sort of Gloucestershire, Somerset, Wiltshire, that sort of area. So maps is a good place. Probably another key tip is actually when you're researching is to go backwards in time. So if you do have access to subscription sites and it's at places like Ancestry or Find My Past, and you want to delve straight into, I don't know, the 1851 census, but actually researching houses can get really complicated if you jump too far back. So because house numbers change, house names change, street names change. So actually you can end up getting very lost if you don't know where you are. So to sort of work back in time. And you obviously on those sites, you can view other sources. So the census is another key one. There's something called the 1939 Register, which was taken in the first month of the Second World War. And it's a brilliant source. It's like a census, but it was taken to get people's details for ID books and books, ID cards. So it gives people's names, it gives their date of birth, it gives their occupation, that you can find just by looking at that and finding out. Even in recent history, you know, I've done a few where it's just brilliant. You know, I found perhaps a 19-year-old daughter of a house, but then find that she's a volunteer ambulance driver, and you just think, oh my gosh, that's how amazing is that? Like, it just totally changes your perspective on a 19-year-old girl living with her parents, you know. So yeah, that sort of thing. And there's a load of there's things like electoral registers, directories, and then the further you go back in time, you start getting some different sources like tax records, land tax. There's things called parish rates, which is effectively like council tax records, but before there was council tax. So it's often recorded as the poor rate because it was a tax on the property in order to pay for the poor relief in that community, in that parish. And the records show obviously who was paying the tax at that house, and so it can record details, and that can go back into the 18th century, so it sort of helps you track it back. So hopefully there's obviously a few other sources if you really want to go for it, but hopefully that will give people a few places to start.
That's great. And just a couple more questions. One is, Stephen wants to know, have you ever done research into shop history? In
shops? Not really, not specifically, no. But I mean, the same principles will apply in a lot of ways. I mean, actually probably get some slightly different sources, but and also because in a lot of cases, obviously people lived upstairs, you know, they lived above the shop, you know, it's historically more traditional that, you know, the shopkeeper downstairs, whether it was a fruit and veg shop or a butcher or a gentleman's outfitter, quite often the family lived upstairs. So actually you can find a lot of links. And there's things like directories are probably very good for that. So it's like a phone book, but it was a list of addresses. So you can actually track, and quite often it started as trade directories, because it was, if you lived in a village in Lincolnshire and you wanted to find your local blacksmith or something, you know, you would look in the directory. That's kind of the gist of it. But so you can actually find people's occupations or a record of the business at an address. So yeah, that's
great. And one more question, which is, when did you first realize you wanted to study house history? Was there a defining moment that inspired you?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Yes.
there wasn't one moment, but I have to say, when I studied history at university, and I studied modern British history, and obviously loved it. And I actually moved to England when I was working in publishing. But I was always one of those people, maybe because I didn't grow up in England, but I was always one of these people walking along the street looking up. And I was always looking up to see what the houses were like. And I actually, one of my first jobs was working in Covent Garden, 20 years ago now. And so obviously there's so much history in Covent Garden, and I would often look up and go, oh my word, what was that? You know, like, who lived there? You know, so even before I knew you could do this as a job, you know, I was always doing that. And even, you know, if you're on the top level of a bus and the bus is going along the street, and you can look at the top levels, because quite often you get lost by what's on the ground floor. But actually, if you're looking along the upper floors, and it gives you you might see this amazing architectural feature, or you might see that there's a dramatic change in the buildings. And yeah, so I was always doing that. So when I found the estate agent, who obviously wanted someone who could do historic research, but at the time I applied, I didn't know it was to be a house historian. So it just all fell into place, though. So that was definitely the coming together of lots of things, and it was just ended up being perfect.
Yeah, a lot of looking up. It's always valuable to look up, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Well, Melanie, thank you so much for your time and all your answers. It was fascinating, really, really, really lovely and really great. So thank you. And of course, thank you to the audience for, I want to say coming out, but you haven't, have you, for logging in this evening. And of course, thank you to Nikki and Becky and the Winchester Heritage Open Days team. And as they said, there's lots more going on in Winchester and beyond across the rest of the weekend. So do check out the website for more details. And thank you all. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. Bye.